Hi, everyone. Welcome to the January 28th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we are going to take a look back at the Pegasus World Cup day card at Gulfstream Park, highlighting that big race, the Pegasus World Cup, as well as the Pegasus World Cup Turf, along with all of the other graded stakes and maiden and allowance races that they ran at Gulfstream Park on Saturday. Then we'll move on to Oaklawn Park to discuss their opening weekend there, which included a Derby prep, the Smarty Jones, along with some interesting stakes races on their Saturday card. Then we'll move on to discuss a few stakes from Aqueduct, Santa Anita, and Sam Houston last Sunday. But we're going to begin with that Pegasus World Cup day card. And Craig, I don't know how you felt about watching these races. It's a different storyline than we've dealt with in past years, where we were treated to really special performances from horses like Arrogate and Gunrunner and City of Light, and kind of had to grapple with this idea that we were never going to see them again. We're not dealing with that now that Omaha Beach didn't participate, but still, I had some trouble getting excited about these races as the championship events that they were billed as.
Yeah, I don't think they were championship events at all. Like you said, they certainly didn't live up to it from a speed figure perspective. They were nowhere near some of the performances we've seen. Though the figure Mucho Gusto ran a 129 is certainly a respectable grade 1 performance. It's not what you would think you're going to get from the best horse out there running in the biggest race. But obviously, there's some races coming up overseas where some of our probably better horses are being pointed. Just from a clock perspective, I think it was the slowest Pegasus that we've had by over a second. And the track wasn't particularly slow. So, I mean, the clock in this case probably tells the story just as much as speed figures. But that said, I am a little optimistic that we at least saw some good performances. The crop looks pretty weak this year. So you're kind of looking for some horses to step up off their 3-year-old seasons or just improve as they age. And I think Mucho Gusto certainly fit the bill. He was a solid runner as a 3-year-old last year. He had some nice races, and this was his best to date, no doubt about it.
Yeah, that's kind of how I felt. I mean, these horses can improve in the future, but I was left with that feeling watching both this race and the Pegasus and the turf race to a lesser extent that, there's got to be better out there. And I think there is. But I think, as you were alluding to, the fact that we have these 3 major races now, along with the Dubai World Cup and this new Saudi Cup, we expected this would happen. But the quality of each race, I think, is going to be a little bit diluted. And it reminds me of the old days when the big winter races were the Don Handicap and the Santa Anita Handicap and the Oaklawn Handicap. And neither one of those races were world championships individually, but they created an interesting series where you might see one of the best horses show up in 1 or 2 of them. And I think that's what we're getting these days. So I don't think that the Pegasus World Cup is what it once was when it was initiated. That said, like as you were saying, I don't want to take away from the performance of Mucho Gusto. This was him at his best. Credit to Bob Baffert for getting this kind of performance out of this horse, because I think you'd agree with me. I never really saw Mucho Gusto as a horse that really wanted to go 1 1/8, 1 1/4, or a horse that was going to be capable of winning top grade 1 races like this. So he's obviously doing better than he was as a 3-year-old now that he's entered his 4-year-old season. Credit to Irad Ortiz as well for giving this horse a perfect trip, because he really hustled him out of the gate, knew he had to get over from that outside post position, and just stalked what turned out to be a fairly moderate pace. And I think that's important to note, because that probably helped the runner-up Mr. Freeze hang on for second here.
Yeah, I think he was about at his limit as far as distance goes, but he ran a good figure as well, a 126. But just for record, that's a little below par for a grade 1, and he was the runner-up. I think War Story running third, I mean, as gallant and as game a horse as he is, him being third kind of says a lot about the quality of this race from a depth perspective. Diamond Oops was a horse. I think this was probably just too far for him. And then when you check back in 5th, it was Bodie Express, who just looked really overmatched to me on paper, and he was still able to hang on for that 5th position. So while I was impressed with Mucho Gusto, the rest, I could take them with a grain of salt. Not going to get very excited about any of them.
No, I agree with this. And this race did have those 2 notable no-shows, as Tax and Higher Power finished last and second to last. I don't think too many people would have foreseen that. They just didn't show up for whatever reason, and that did bring down the overall quality of the race and slightly take away, I think, from the winning performance of Mucho Gusto, just because in the end, based on what he was beating, it was more of a grade 2 type of field. So we'll see what these horses do in the future. But at least Mucho Gusto did earn a pretty encouraging speed figure here, assuming that he continues to stay healthy and goes on to those other top level races. He's going to be a force to be reckoned with. Let's move on to that Pegasus World Cup turf, going 1 mile and 3/16, one race earlier. This race, as we talked about on the forecast beforehand, was going to be all about the trips, and it indeed was all about the trips, as the horse that got the best ride and trip was undoubtedly Zulu Alpha, who just broke from the inside, stayed on the rail the entire way. It opened up for Tyler Gaffaleone at the top of the stretch, and he had the horse to send on through, and it all worked out for this horse on this day.
Yeah, he got a perfect trip, and he was certainly no slouch coming in. He had run as fast as anybody last time out on our speed figures. And as you said, when you combine that with a perfect trip, he's going to be tough to beat. I thought Magic Wand, who shipped in for Aidan O'Brien, she made the pace in a race that didn't look like it had much pace. So it's kind of hard to knock. You don't want to be unaggressive in those spots. And she just didn't have that finishing kick. I personally picked her on the forecast and better. And I was a little annoyed when the rail gets left open, as I often do get. But in the end, I do think Zulu Alpha was probably the best horse, the way he spurted away at the end. And it would have took some bad luck for him not to win after he sat that trip most of the race.
Yeah, I do want to give a mention to Ryan Moore's ride on Magic Wand, because as we also talked about before the race, there was just no speed and no clear frontrunner in this group. And I think he deserves credit for recognizing that and sending Magic Wand, who has not really been a frontrunner in the past, sending her to the lead from that outside post position, because it really did give her her best chance to be successful here. We saw some other horses who had some tactical speed that weren't ridden nearly as aggressively. For instance, Mo Forza, who ended up just getting hung out wide around both turns. And you just can't be successful with that kind of trip in a congested field like this. And Magic Wand avoided all of that. It is noteworthy, I think, that the top 3 finishers were 3 horses that stayed on the rail for the entire running of the race. That just, I think, highlights how important ground loss was in this 12-horse field.
Yeah, it certainly was. And just to keep in mind with the speed figures, when we're dealing, I talk about this often, but when you're dealing with Gulfstream Park, these are often figures based on just one race, because they just run so many combinations of run-ups and rails and distances that's all you really have to work with. You just can't compare a lot of these races. So, I mean, while I'm fairly confident the figures are a pretty good representation of what we saw, I mean, it's not based on a lot of information.
Yeah, and I saw some people were asking about the figures and the fact that a horse like Zulu Alpha ran a new career top in here. I mean, I don't think it should be that surprising that in a Grade 1 race that's this competitive, the horse that wins is going to have to run a new career top to win a race like this. So it's not like he hadn't run some fast speed figures before, as you were saying. There were a lot of trips in this race. We can't go through them all now. I think this is a race I'm going to discuss on my Horses to Watch segment this week, because there are some runners that really were compromised that had trouble here that I think you could go into a little more depth about why they had trouble in this race. But we'll move on for now and talk about some of the other graded stakes racing that took place at Gulfstream Park on Saturday. Going 1 mile on the dirt, they ran the Fred W. Hooper for the older horses early in the day, and Fat Man stepped up and beat this field, got a pretty good trip from about mid-pack. I think the other notable performance, though, was turned in by the runner-up Zendin, who survived what was a pretty quick pace.
Yeah, he did. I wouldn't have any problem with anybody that argued that he was probably the best horse in the race, but he was beat by the trip. It was a fast pace, as we predicted in the TimeformUS Pace projector, and it just set up for a horse like the Fat Man. I think there is a different horse called the Fat Man. But anyway, this one's just fat with the PH. He got a 119 for the win, which is solid. It's about grade 3 type maybe or so. Zendin got a 121 as the runner up, and yeah, not a whole lot to say about this one other than I think trips made the difference in the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I really have to add is that we were right about this race on the forecast last week, saying that you don't want to accept a short price on Free Enterprise. It's just never wise to accept a short price on a horse that has to improve on the speed figure scale to beat the toughest field he's ever facing. And that was the case with Free Enterprise. And he ran a decent enough race to finish 9th based on the speed figures he'd run previously. He just didn't take that step forward. And at 9-5, you're not supposed to be betting on a horse to do that.
No, and when you do that, I want to add you still got to get the winner, which I didn't. I went with Tale of Silence, who we talked about, and he just threw in another clunker, so 2 in a row. So I think I'm about ready to write him off. But you do want to take a stand in these races. You're not always going to be right, but when you are, you're going to get paid.
Yeah, aside from Fat Man, it seemed like horses had trouble making up ground from far back, even though there was a fast pace in the race. I still think Zendon deserves credit for holding on, but it was just curious to me that nobody made a real run from the back of the pack in that race. That was not the case in the Inside Information, which was run a little later in the card, going these 7 furlongs, as Pink Sands just seems like she's really found her niche in these one-turn races at Gulfstream Park that have a little pace in them. As long as Jose Ortiz can work out any kind of trip for her, she just has developed this really strong late turn of foot in the stretch, and she just ran this field over in the lane.
She did. And to be fair, she didn't get a particularly super fast pace as we predicted. I mean, it was a solid pace. The final time figure was certainly lower than the certainly lower than the early pace figures. But I mean, she just exploded through the lane. It wasn't a particularly fast race overall. She only got a 107 TimeformUS speed figure, which was a slight improvement over her last time when she won at a 1-turn mile. And as we kind of both predicted, Spice Perfection was just an underlay in here. She hadn't really been worthy of the kind of betting action she was receiving. And she just ran, she had a really no excuse fourth where she got a decent trip and just got run down late and actually got passed late for third as well.
Yeah, and I don't want to go overboard. I'm a fan of Pink Sands. I have been for a long time, and it's gratifying to see her finally turning into the kind of graded stakes horse that I thought she could be. But it's not like she's running top level speed figures that a horse should be running to win grade 2 level stakes races. I just don't think there's a lot of quality behind her, especially once a horse like Spice Perfection doesn't show up. So we'll see who shows up in some of these races moving forward. But I acknowledge that Pink Sands is going to have to get a little faster to maintain this position that she's attained at the moment.
Yeah, she's a horse that definitely needs a setup she's been getting, but she is fully able to take advantage because that late finishing kick is really eye-catching. I mean, she swooped the field. I'm sure she lost some lengths on the turn and still ran by him all easily. So that's something you can't ever really ignore when they can finish that way.
Now, I would imagine that a lot of people's pick 6 and pick 5 and pick 4 tickets were blown up on this card in the WL McKnight, which was run one race before the 2 Pegasus World Cup races, as Spooky Channel caused a massive upset here. I think he was 36-1 as he ran down cross border to win this race by a neck. Kind of a funny horse. He was the king of turf paradise once upon a time, had ventured out to some other venues in the past year or so and hadn't done too well, but maybe he just needed some more distance.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be his thing. I mean, it's kind of hard to know where a race at Turf Paradise, a $30,000 stakes race like he won at 1 7/8 fits. But he's obviously a horse that wants to run all day because he hasn't run particularly fast or good enough to even compete in a race like this at shorter distances. But once you get out to that 1.5 miles, he really seems to thrive. And, I guess that's about the only way I could have come up with him. I didn't in this case, and it did blow up my pick 4 ticket because I wasn't going to use him even after the fact I couldn't come up with any real reason to. But the 123 he ran this day makes him competitive in the grade 2, grade 3 types at these longer distances.
Yeah, it's a race I don't know what to make of because on paper, Red Knight looked like he just was going to dominate this field. From a speed figure standpoint, he had the advantage. From a class standpoint, he had the advantage. And for whatever reason, Red Knight didn't show up. Sure, he was a little far back and a little wide around the second turn, but still, he didn't finish this race off at all in the stretch. He's not supposed to be losing ground to a horse like Appreciato at the end. So without him really running his A race, it did get a lot easier. Cross border, I guess, finally ran back to that surprising performance in the Turf Classic from last fall, earning a 123 here as well. Still, though, this was not the strongest race, so I'd want to see all of these horses do it again.
Yeah, and one thing I do want to mention is for whatever reason, Trackus doesn't record 1.25 mile times, so you can't really calculate any pace figures other than that opening half mile, which I do. I don't know why. It would seem like a turf race, the last quarter mile is something that you would want as a pretty valuable piece of information. But for whatever reason, they don't provide it. Also, as I mentioned earlier, there were 2 mile-and-a-half races run at Gulfstream. We're going to talk about the other one. But again, they were run on 2 completely different courses. One was run on the inner part of the course. I think the rail was at 36. The other was way out at like 96 or something like that. The one had a very short run up, one had a very long run up. So just don't even think about trying to compare times from these races. That's where figures come in handy because it will save you a lot of time. But looking at the times, these things would make no sense.
Speaking of Trackus at Gulfstream, not to be too much of a curmudgeon, and I know Trackus has issues separate from this, but can they do something about those chiclets on the bottom of the screen during the races? Because that oblong rectangle shape that they use and condensing them all into the center of the screen, it just makes it impossible to figure out where your horse is during the race, especially if they're off the screen. It's just because of the shape and the way they're all grouped together so closely, it's just impossible to tell the margins between horses. It almost makes watching the race harder. So they might want to take a look at that and just redesign that whole graphical layout because I don't think it's helping. That's just a pet peeve of mine.
I agree with that.
Speaking of that other mile-and-a-half race, that one, the La Prévoyante for the fillies and mares, was won by Mean Mary. This one, they went around 3 times. I think it kind of knew what the result was going to be as they came around that first turn, as Mean Mary was just going as easily as could be, like she was out for a morning gallop and nobody was pressuring her.
Yeah, this was kind of crazy. I mean, she looked like a horse who was going to get an easy lead in here. It was just a matter of if she could get the distance and how far. But this was actually the turf race with a really long run up to the start, and it just didn't seem to matter. She still was able to get away with a 51.5, I think it was, and just was never really challenged. So I think from a handicapping perspective, you can just put a line through this race for most of them in here. Know that she's going to be tough to beat when she gets an easy lead, Mean Mary. But otherwise, I just can't take a whole lot out of this race because nobody decided to be aggressive at any point other than Luis Saez on the leader. And even him, I wouldn't say was aggressive. He just got handed the race. So other than that, not a big take and not any real big takeaways from this one for me.
Yeah, I want to be careful praising this horse too much for all the reasons you mentioned, but I will say this horse might be pretty good, Mean Mary. She's not always going to get this kind of favorable setup, but this was just her 4th career start on turf, just her 5th career start overall. She's shown a lot of ability right from the start. Apparently, she has no trouble going these longer distances. She's got that Dynaformer pedigree on the dam side, and you can see that influence in her. She's in good hands with Graham Motion. This is a filly that I think we can be a little bit excited about going forward, because I'm not going to be surprised if she turns out to be pretty good. I can't say the same for the rest of the horses in this field. I thought Lady Ponime was ridiculously overbet because I frankly didn't like her 2 races that much from 2018, and she hadn't run in over a year. I just don't think you're ever supposed to accept short prices on horses like that, even when they're trained by Chad Brown. So I'm not too enthusiastic about the rest of the field, but I think Mean Mary, the winner, is okay.
Yeah, you make a good point. I wasn't really knocking her at all. I was just mostly knocking the rest of the field. She's certainly promising as a lightly raced horse running a 118 speed figure going a mile and a half. The future is bright for her, and speed is always a weapon. So.
Now, speaking of overbet favorites, the one that I think really took the cake on Saturday was Shecky Shabazz going off at 2-5 in this World of Trouble turf sprint. I mean, I know he's going out for connections who also campaigned the horse that the race is named after. I don't know if that's significant at all. But, I mean, we had talked about this previously as we, I think, covered all of the major contenders' prior races on previous episodes of the Pacecast, those being Shecky Shabazz, Texas Wedge, and Karatari. Those two, Karatari and Texas Wedge, had run faster speed figures than Shecky Shabazz, yet they just went all in on Shecky Shabazz.
Yeah, only thing I can figure is it's the Jason Service factor. He just wins so much, people sometimes get lazy and just assume he's going to win. But this wasn't like a new acquisition for him. I think we knew what we had with Shecky Shabazz. We've been talking about him since the Breeders' Cup. He's fine when he gets a good trip, but he drew the rail in a race with a lot of speed. You knew he was going to get pressed if he went for the lead or was going to have to work out a trip otherwise. And it was just a race that made no sense. As you said, Texas Wedge looked like he was going to get a great setup, and he did. Caratari is a horse who has run just as fast and drew a more favorable outside post. So it was no surprise at all to me that these two were able to beat him.
No, I mean, the two horses with the fastest speed figures in the race combined for an exacta that paid $54 for $2. You don't see that every day. So, yeah, they're both nice horses. I think there's always very little separating these turf sprinters, and trips are going to decide these races quite a bit. But I know that they hadn't run in the races of the prestige that Checky Shabazz had, but I think Caratari and Texas Wedge are both on par with that horse.
Yeah, and I should mention they both ran a 120 in this race, which, you know, it's right about what they've been running all the time. And Checky Shabazz ran a 118, which is pretty much what he's been running. So it was just a matter of the price in this spot. I mean, wouldn't it surprise me if Checky won the race? He certainly had the ability. It was just the price that was a bit crazy.
Now, before we move on to the other venues, let's quickly mention a couple of maiden races that they ran for the 3-year-olds on Saturday at Gulfstream. I know people pay attention to these races because often you see barns try to debut or start some highly regarded maidens on these big days. Todd Pletcher won both of these races. I think the horse that got more people talking was the first-time starter Market Analysis that won his debut in the 4th race, going 7 furlongs. Son of Honor Code was stalking an honest pace. I thought he looked pretty good.
Yeah, they looked okay. I mean, these horses didn't blow me away, but they could improve, of course. They're lightly raced 3-year-olds. Both of the winners, Candy Tycoon and Market Analysis, ran 103 TimeformUS speed figures. I guess you got to give a little bit of an edge to Market Analysis for doing it first time out. But, you know, if these two are going to jump in the stakes company, they're obviously going to have to improve a bit and stretch out. So I'll just wait and see where they show up. And it's just kind of a matter of how much money they take and who they show up against.
Yeah, Candy Tycoon feels like a horse to me that just won via attrition because, I mean, he has been touted in all 4 of his starts prior to this, including at Saratoga when he was supposed to be Todd Pletcher's best 2-year-old training up there. And it's taken him 5 starts to break his maiden. So I wouldn't get too excited about that horse just yet. Let's move on to Oaklawn Park, where they began their 2020 season this past Friday. And the feature race that day was the Smarty Jones, the first of their Derby preps that they'll run down there, going the 1-mile distance, which features that short stretch run. And I think that influenced the race a little bit because we sometimes see speed be dangerous in these races with the short stretch. And Gold Street, who was one of 4 Steve Asmussen runners in this race, didn't look like he was going to get that easy a lead on paper, but none of the other speeds either got out of the gate or were sent that aggressively. And he just controlled up front through pretty slow fractions.
He did. And this race is kind of, I mean, it's one I'm basically going to put a line through for everybody. It was run over a track that we have as favoring speed, coded in pink. All the fractions are in blue, meaning the pace was slow, which I don't even think you needed pace figures. If you watch the replay, it was pretty obvious. And not to take anything away from Gold Street, he won. He got a 106 TimeformUS speed figure, which was his highest to date. The final time was a 109. So he ran okay, but the race just had that look of one that's not going to have a lot of meaning going forward on the Derby trail. If I had to have one horse out of here, I'd probably go all the way back to 4th and Silver Prospector, who actually did at least some running late. 3 Technique ran okay, I guess. He got a 103. He was a bit against the pace, but I would be more likely to judge these horses on other races than this one.
Yeah, we completely agree here. I really have nothing to add. I also think Silver Prospector is a horse that you'd want to give another shot to next time if you liked him coming into this race because he just didn't have a fair chance here. And the others, they just didn't blow me away. So I'll look for more in the future, kind of as you were saying. On Saturday at Oaklawn Park, they had 3 stakes races, 2 actually. One of them was split into 2 divisions, so 2 different stakes races, 3 stakes races in total. They ran 2 divisions of the 5th season for the older horses. The first division was won by Guest Sweet, who ran a decent race. He's a horse that has been good since his 3-year-old season. I believe he was once on the Derby trail. He's sort of been middling in these listed stakes races ever since then. But he put in a pretty good effort here to run down Snapper Sinclair.
Yeah, he did. I mean, it was a solid effort, and his form was a little bit disguised because he had run on synthetic the last couple times. Hadn't run particularly well. He got a couple thirds in a minor stakes and an allowance. But the time before that, he had run a good second while being, I think he got elevated to the win with a 116 on the dirt at Churchill. So he's certainly fitting here, and I think people probably missed on him just because of those synthetic races. But it was a pretty evenly matched race. The horses were the top two were closely bunched at the finish, and I don't know what to make of this one. Again, it was a muddy track, just like it was on Friday. So good effort. I don't think we saw any graded stakes horses in these. I'm sure they'll show up in races like the I don't even remember what they're called. I know we have the Oaklawn Handicap, but
Razorback, Essex. I think so. I don't know what order they're running.
Razorback is the one I was thinking of. I'm sure some of these will show up, and you just never know given the state of the older horse division. Maybe they can catch an easy field and win, but they would certainly need to do that.
Yeah, I think the stronger division of this race was the second one, which was won by Pioneer Spirit. It featured some horses that had back class, like Mosito Rojo and Bravazzo. They didn't show up with their best efforts, but Pioneer Spirit did. And Pioneer Spirit is just turning into a pretty reliable kind of horse. He loves to win races. He doesn't always do it by very large margins, but he seems to know where the wire is. And he's continued to hold his form for the new Robertino Diodoro barn.
Yeah, and I should mention the prior division got a 117 for the win. This one got a 118. Pioneer Spirit was a horse we talked about on the Pacecast, I think one of the Pacecast or forecasts, because he was claimed for $150,000 a couple starts back. You don't see that very often, but he's won two since, a $75,000 stake and now a $100,000 stake. So they're well on their way to getting their investment back. I thought he ran well. There's not a whole lot more to add to it. He didn't get an easy lead, but he was right up there on the front end. The pace wasn't overly taxing, and he was just able to hold off Bankit. Bankit, I thought, did run well. He closed with the end of that moderate pace, and it really was a pretty tight photo at the end. So both of the top two ran well for me.
Yeah, Bankit's a nice horse who showed some ability as a 3-year-old. He still has to take that step forward. He's the kind of horse that I'd love to see them turn back to one-turn races, going 7 furlongs or a mile at some point in the future, because I think that's where his late kick is the strongest. But we'll see what path they decide to take with him. The one other race we'll talk about from this past weekend at Oaklawn was the Pippin Stakes, which was also run on the Saturday card for the fillies and mares. This one featured a pretty fast pace up front as Lady Subi just kind of ran off on the front end and ran everybody into the ground, set it up for a closer, and the only one that could really take advantage of the situation was Whoa Nelly.
Yeah, I was watching and trying to bet these races a little bit during the Gulfstream card, and also Santa Anita was going. And this was one I was actually looking forward to betting because of the pace setup. We had kind of predicted that in the pace projector. And Whoa Nelly was our top late pace horse, and she was listed at 20-1. So I'm going to nominate this as the worst morning line of the weekend. There were a couple scratches in here, but of the remaining 9, she still had the 8th highest of the 9, and she actually wound up going off the favorite there. Here. So when I tuned in, my excitement kind of went away and I wound up just passing on the race. But not much to add other than she got a perfect setup. She took full advantage. She ran a nice 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure, which I think is her career best, and just kind of fell into the trip. So not much else to add.
Yeah, it seems like the bettors at Oaklawn were savvy to how the pace figured to shape up, because they did bet down a few of the closers, including Whoa Nelly in this race. She's got to step up in the future. I thought it was interesting that this was just her stakes debut for Larry Jones, who's really allowed her to run through her allowance conditions as a 3-year-old prior to this. Got to run faster in the future, but at least she's heading in the right direction for a good barn. Let's talk about the one stakes we're going to discuss from this past weekend at Aqueduct that was run on Saturday. The Jazel Stakes for the older horses, going 1 1/8 over a very wet, sloppy track where it just rained all day at Aqueduct. That didn't affect Mr. Buff, the winner, too much, as he hadn't shown a real preference for that kind of track in the past, but it didn't hinder him at all here, as he just ran them off their feet. A horse like Laytone tried to go after him early. Didn't matter too much to Mr. Buff. Seemed at a brief point at the top of the stretch like he might be getting a little tired, but the closers just really couldn't make up any ground on him.
Yeah, this was interesting races. Leotone, who we had talked about, tried to take it to him, and he just couldn't. Mr. Buff and he went fast, as you had pointed out on Twitter. I didn't have the figures at the time, but his early figures were 150 and 145. So over that sloppy track, he was flying, and you can see what happened to the others, as I think it was the two longest shots in the field rallied to get up for second and third, while the two horses most people thought would be his biggest competition, I mentioned Leotone and Stan the Man, just faltered out of it and got past late because they just couldn't keep up and got exhausted. Mr. Buff wound up with a 127 Timeform US speed figure that was boosted a big 8 points off the final time of 119 because of that fast pace. So all in all, just an impressive performance by Mr. Buff. He's shown he can just keep beating up on these New York breds. I don't know if they'll try open company again anytime soon, but if they do, I hope they stay in New York because his travels haven't worked out very well.
Yeah, I was going to say that Mr. Buff he's a really cool New York bred. I mean, he's running the kind of speed figures that should make him a graded stakes winner at some point. I know he hasn't accomplished that yet. He's a gelding, so he's going to stay in training this year. Seems like he doesn't mind running every 4 weeks. He just is able to hold his form. He's been doing this forever. So we'll see where they decide to go with him next. But I do hope that they're able to find a race for him this year where he can really shine against open company graded stakes horses. Maybe it would be a race like the Suburban going 1.25 miles in July. That's usually a race that would play to a horse's the strengths of a horse like him. Maybe they'd even stretch him out to 1.5 miles to a race like the Brooklyn, because it seems like he's just a grinding type that can run horses into the ground on the lead. So we'll see what they do with him, but he's definitely has a future of racing in more than just New York bred races if he continues to post speed figures like he did on Saturday. We discussed the Palos Verdes on the forecast last week, which was the feature race this past weekend at Santa Anita. Grade 2 event going 6 furlongs for the older horses. Unfortunately, this race scratched down from 6 runners to 4 runners, and that really changed the race as the speed came out. Axeman, who figured to press the pace, Bob Baffert elected to run him in a turf race on Sunday instead, which I didn't get at all. But anyway, there were 4 horses left in the race, and Captain Scotty, who I know you liked, seemed like he'd have a little trouble making the lead when the race was first drawn. But once those other speeds came out, I mean, he just looked like a far more likely winner.
He did. I mean, I still took the 7-2 given the makeup of the field. He jumped up to being a lone leader on the pace projector, which is never a bad thing. He took full advantage. All the fractions were in blue. We have the track coded in pink as somewhat favoring speed. I thought Flagstaff was the only real horse he had to beat. As we talked about Speed Pass, he was another, like you said, a lately raced horse who was coming in off a couple wins, but he just didn't really have the speed figures to compete, and he didn't compete at all. He was never really a factor in this race. So good effort by Captain Scotty. He got a 118, knocked down 4 points because of the slow pace, but I'm pretty sure he's a horse who can consistently run in the 120s, and out in California right now, that's going to make him a force in the sprint division. There is the thing that, maybe he's a need to lead horse. Personally, I wish Axeman hadn't scratched, because maybe it was the turf, but he just didn't look very good at all on Sunday. So I would have taken my chances had he stayed in, but it'll be interesting to see. I know we're not talking about the race Axeman was in, but I'm sure he'll probably show back up on dirt next time. But given what I saw, I would probably take a shot against him, because he just didn't look very good to me at all.
Well, it definitely wasn't a vote of confidence from Bob Baffert to bypass this race to run in a turf race. So regardless of how he ran, I just don't think what's going on with that horse is yielding positive vibes. But I agree about Captain Scotty. He still ran well to win this race. We'll see what happens in the future when he gets into a race with more speed, but he's capable of running faster than he had to here. I mean, he's a horse that can make the lead over other speeds in a race. It's just a matter of whether he can withstand that pressure. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this California turf division plays out throughout the winter. Final venue we'll visit is Sam Houston. They had a big card on Sunday, including a couple of graded stakes. One of those was the John B. Connolly Turf Cup going 1.5 miles. Grade 3 event. I know that turf course had taken a little bit of rain. I believe it was rated good. That didn't affect Dot Matrix at all, as he seems to run over any kind of turf course. The only real question for Dot Matrix, I think, was getting the distance. He had gone to 1 3/8 adequately in the past, and he got the 1.5 miles here. I think it helped that Florent Giroux was aggressive enough to put him up close to what turned out to be a pretty slow pace, but he was game to hold them all off in the stretch.
He was. Like you said, I think the ride made the difference in the trip. We have the opening quarter mile and half mile coded in blue as being slow, and I don't think there's much doubt they were slow. And he just got the head start on his competition. He got a 1:18 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. The other horse that did impress me in here was Bema's Boy. He's come quite a way from romping in a claiming race at Saratoga when I was actually there last summer. I'm sure you were there as well. He looks like a real stakes competitor now. And if any horse took the worst of it from the pace scenario, it was him, as he came from further back than any of the others in the top 4. So both of the top 2 were good. Like I said, I don't want to knock Dot Matrix. He took advantage of the pace. That doesn't mean he couldn't have run well if he didn't. He certainly would have, as he's proven to be a solid horse that almost always shows up. But the top 2 for me, the rest, I could take him or leave him.
Yeah, and Mike Maker, who trains Bema's Boy, just seems to have a knack for figuring out which of the horses in his barn want to go these marathon distances. And I don't think Bema's Boy had shown any kind of preference prior to coming into Mike Maker's barn to run those races. But Mike Maker just seems to know which horses are going to be able to handle it, and Bema's Boy certainly has. Though credit to Dot Matrix for holding off 2 Mike Maker horses who were charging at him late. He was game to win this race. He's a New York bred, so he's got plenty of options for where to run in the future, assuming that they keep him in training. So he's a runner that I think we can definitely look forward to later on in 2020. Final race we'll talk about on the podcast this week was the Grade 3 Houston Ladies Classic, that feature race from Sam Houston on Sunday. And this turned out to be a real barn burner, as the 3-year-olds from last year, who have now just turned 4, they really put on a show. Serengeti Empress was the big favorite here, but she took a little bit of pressure early, and Ricardo Santana just always had Lady Apple, the eventual winner, in position behind her, saving ground on the inside, and the rail just opened up for him in the lane.
Yeah, this was one I griped earlier about a horse who got beat up. One of my horses got beat by a horse coming up the rail, and I kind of reversed it here. So that's why I'm trying to be more calm about not worrying about things like that, because they all seem to even out. Lady Apple had run a big 1:20 TimeformUS speed figure, and I think it was the Remington Oaks on Oklahoma Derby day. And I'll be the first to admit I was a little concerned maybe the figures from that day were too high. It was kind of iffy. Some horses had come back to run well, some not so well between that race and the Oklahoma Derby. But it turns out they were probably fine. We already saw Mucho Gusto. That's where he had last run. He came into this one to win the Pegasus, and Lady Apple, albeit with a very generous trip, perfect trip, got all the ground, squeezed through inside, backed that race up with a good 1:23. Serengeti Empress ran a 1:24, boosted a little bit because of that fast pace she was pressed into. It wasn't fast enough to get coded red, but the pace figures were in the 1:30s. I don't even know if she's capable of running slower, to be honest. She's the interesting filly for me. I'm curious what they're going to do with her. She looks like a horse who can sprint, who can go long, and they're going to have a lot of options with her. And also, I was encouraged to see Street Band run well. She didn't run very well over that kind of not silly, but just crazy track at San Anito and Breeders' Cup week, where some horses just hated it, and I think she was one of them. But she rebounded nicely to get a 1:22. She had run a 1:24, winning, I think it was the Cotillion at Park. So she's going to be a force in the division as well.
Yeah, this is a race that encouraged me quite a bit, because I know we had talked last year about the 3-year-old males perhaps not being the greatest group ever. I know we have a slightly different take on that than some other people, but I don't think there's any question that the 3-year-old fillies as a group ran some pretty impressive speed figures last year. So I don't think it should come as any great surprise that they're stepping up now as 4-year-olds. And I think all of these horses are going to be exciting new additions to the division, because, I mean, with Midnight Bisou staying in trading, but, a late retired, I believe Blue Prize is retiring too. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. So I think that there are other spots open now for horses to win these big races. And I think it's just encouraging to see horses like Lady Apple, Serengeti Empress, and even Street Band continuing to run these kinds of speed figures. I agree with everything you said about the trips of the top two. Street Band was wide throughout. I think that hindered her a little bit, but she still ran well. So I'm intrigued to see where these horses go from here.
Yeah, same for me. And like, as you said, you mentioned Midnight Bisou, who I think is running in the Saudi race, if I'm not mistaken. But the speed figures, and she won this race last year, but the speed figures we see in here are just as good as anything she ran last year. So I agree with you. It looks like a strong group.
Well, those are all the races we're going to recap this week. Of course, we'll be back on Friday to do the TimeformUS forecast, where we handicap next weekend's races. And it's going to be an exciting weekend next week because we've got the Derby preps kicking up into high gear. We've got 3 of them, I believe. There's the Withers at Aqueduct, the Holy Bull down in Florida, and the Robert B. Lewis at Santa Anita. So I assume we'll talk about all of those races on the forecast on Friday of this week. For now, though, you can always listen to both of these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts on any of those outlets. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel and take in all of this content. So thanks for listening this week, guys, and we'll be back on Friday.